Welcome to the edge of the Missouri River, the year 1898, where a restless wind carried voices no one could explain. This is Dead Man's Bluff, a ridge above the floodplain, where the air itself once spoke back. The watchman that night, William Carr, wrote it first, his logbook trembling in the lantern glow. He heard English syllables, drawn thin by the wind, a message that seemed to know his name. The final page still sits in Boone County's archive, ink-smeared words fading into silence. They are speaking again. The night began like any other. The steady click of the telegraph key, the hum of wire in the cold. Then silence. A strange lull heavy as breath, held too long. And from across the valley came the whisper, human deliberate, repeating the exact rhythm Carr had sent moments earlier. Dots and dashes that never touched the line, answering through air alone. Before we go deeper, leave a comment where you're watching from, and the exact second you're hearing this. Some say the sound shifts with every listener, that if you stay long enough, the frequency bends toward your name. What would you do? If the night began to answer back, autumn 1898. The United States, fresh from war overseas, raced to conquer distance itself. Telegraph lines ran like veins of copper lightning across the plains, stitching the continent together, one pulse at a time. Dead Man's Bluff became an experiment, a remote relay post for testing long-range signal coils. 3 operators arrived with barrels of lamp oil, brass transmitters, and no belief in anything they couldn't measure. Yet what they heard defied every law they knew. Carr's first report mentioned unusual wind resonance. 2 nights later, the pulses formed words. Commands in military code. Hold line. Signal clear. Await order. But the command came from a dismantled station abandoned 2 years earlier. When they checked the frequency logs, nothing. No source. No cross line. Just the wind imitating order. Engineers blamed the iron in the rock, the river's magnetic pull. Even bats tangled in the wire. The local farmers called it something older, the whisperer. They said the bluff remembered the dead, that when the wind hit just right, the land spoke for them. The geology gave it fuel. Beneath the bluff lay seams of quartz and ironstone materials that hum under pressure, the same that would one day power early recording devices. Science calls it piezoelectric resonance. The men there called it the ground talking back. Then came the storm. November 16, 1898, barometer dropping, fast winds screaming from the Dakotas. At 11:17 p.m., the outpost went dark. By dawn, the shack was gone, splintered wood, melted glass, no trace of its crew. Only the telegraph key remained, still pressed down, as if someone refused to let go. The last entry in the book. They are calling again from below. The Jefferson City Tribune printed one short line, 3 missing in river storm. But the story didn't stop there. Downstream fishermen claimed to hear tapping beneath the frozen current, slow, deliberate, like code crawling through water. Residents of Rocheport swore they heard hymns drifting along the banks. Sweet by and by, faint but clear. No one could say where it came from. In time, the official story buried the rest. The Corps rebuilt the telegraph, moved on, and the legend sank under a century of progress. Yet traces remained, a 1901 Signal Corps memo warning operators. Avoid transmission during atmospheric disturbances on the Missouri line. Decades later, a WPA interviewer met the son of one of those lost men. The boy had grown old, his father's warning still sharp. If you ever hear your own signal come back, don't answer it. That single sentence crossed generations, whispered between radio men, field engineers, storm chasers. It became more superstition than history, until the data returned. In 2012, researchers from the University of Kansas set up microbarometers along the bluff. The instruments caught something strange, low frequencies, 17 to 22 hertz, repeating every 4.7 seconds. Almost inaudible, but consistent. When filtered and amplified, faint syllables surfaced. Analysts heard it clearly enough to write it down. Signal received. A century of silence. And then that reply. Perhaps it was only resonance air pressure tricking the ear vibration, folding into pattern, or maybe something in the earth remembered. Sound, after all, leaves fingerprints in stone, in soil, in the air itself. It lingers. It waits. It plays back when conditions align. What if the land holds its own recordings? Memories trapped in mineral veins, waiting for a storm, strong enough to shake them loose. Imagine Carr standing there, coat flapping, lantern burning low, staring into the dark, where his own voice came echoing back. No one believed him. Yet the message kept coming, again and again, through fog and wind, until the night took him. This is not a ghost story. It's a record that refused silence. The line may have been cut, but the message kept traveling through air, through stone, through time. And tonight, we follow it. Because somewhere between the hum of a wire and the breath of the wind lies a question no instrument can measure. What if the world itself remembers what men tried to forget? November 1898. The Missouri River ran iron gray beneath a restless sky. The kind of sky that seemed to lean too low, pressing its weight against the water. The leaves had already fallen from the cottonwoods, their bare branches whistling against the wind. Along the ridge, the outpost stood alone. A wooden shack no larger than a freight car, 2 lanterns hanging from its eaves, and a single telegraph pole piercing the fog like a mast of a ship lost at sea. Inside, 3 men kept watch, Carr Lathrop and a young corporal named Avery. They had come not to chase superstition, but to test distance, to measure silence, to prove that even the farthest edges of the frontier could be wired to speak. The Army Corps had chosen this bluff for a reason. The ground here, rich with iron and quartz, carried current better than most soil. Below the river curved hard eyes, forming a natural echo chamber where sound bounced for miles. To the engineers, it was a perfect test site. To the locals, it was a wound, a place the wind never left alone. In the weeks before the incident, weather reports describe a strange pattern. Barometric drops followed by sudden bursts of static recorded in nearby telegraph lines. One operator in Jefferson City noted unusual cross-frequency bursts, as though 2 lines were talking through each other. The nearest wire, however, ran 40 miles away. No logical cause, no measurable interference, just sound where there should have been silence. The nights were long, bitter cold, and the kind of quiet that makes every creak of timber sound like breath. The men took turns at the key logging transmissions to Fort Leavenworth. The messages were routine line clear, supply delay, signal stable. But after midnight, small irregularities began to appear. Echoes, repeats, sometimes half a word, sometimes whole sentences that none of them sent. Carr, the senior operator, believed it was refraction wind dragging sound across miles of open ground. He explained it to the younger men like a teacher soothing frightened pupils. But even he could not explain why the rhythm matched their own transmissions exactly as if the air itself were learning to mimic them. The telegraph shack smelled of oil and damp pine. Every surface hummed faintly wood soaked with current. The men lived by the pattern of light and dark. Sunrise brought silence, sunset brought static. And beyond that static, something else began to form. Locals told stories about the bluff long before the army arrived. They said the ridge once held a burial site, a trading post that collapsed into the river after a flood in the 1830s. Bones washed downstream for weeks. Settlers named it Dead Man's Bluff because no one knew who the dead were. Even then, they claimed to hear voices rising from the gorge during storms. The Corps dismissed it as folklore, a superstition of farmers and ferrymen. Yet the name stuck, and sometimes names know more than we do. At dusk, mist would rise from the water thick as smoke rolling upward to swallow the shack in pale gray. The men said it smelled metallic, almost electric. The wind made the telegraph wires hum, even when the current was off. Lathrop began keeping a second log, one not filed with official dispatches. "Heard repetition tonight," he wrote. "Not code. Something slower. Like a person trying to learn the rhythm." That same week, the outpost received new coils for testing. The equipment was primitive copper windings, iron plates, hand-cranked induction. When activated, the current bled into the ground, turning the very soil beneath their boots into a conductor. Carr joked that the Earth itself might start sending messages soon. He laughed when he said it, but his hands shook when he logged the time. The tension built slowly, not as fear, but as fatigue. 3 men alone for weeks, watching weather tear through their station, waiting for a signal that wasn't supposed to return. Then the wind changed. It came hard from the northwest, carrying the sound of the river like thunder. The lanterns flickered glass, trembling in their frames. Carr called out to check the line. Lathrop responded, and then through the static, another voice joined in. Same cadence, same breath. Not an echo, not feedback, a perfect mimic. That was the moment the men realized whatever was answering them wasn't somewhere else. It was right there, inside the sound around them. Weather journals from that Wilmette week confirm a pressure inversion, warm air trapping cold air close to the ground, magnifying every vibration. To a physicist, it explains the amplification. To those men, it explained nothing. Because the phrases came back in English. In one of the last recorded transmissions, Carr tapped relay test. A pause. Then faint but clear, the same phrase repeated from the opposite side of the key. He looked to Avery, but the corporal's hands were nowhere near the table. They both froze. And for several seconds, the telegraph spoke without them. Outside, the river's roar grew louder, not from water but from air. Wind screaming through the gully, harmonizing with the wires, producing tones that wavered like voices trying to form syllables. Later analysis would reveal the frequency range between 300 and 400 hertz, identical to human speech. The next morning, Carr filed a formal note. Possible echo effect from canyon duration, 15 seconds mimicry, exact. The note was initialed but never sent. He kept it in his pocket. When the storm hit a week later, it was found still folded in his coat. By mid-November, their fuel was low, their rations half gone. Resupply was delayed by flooding downstream. Yet the Corps insisted they hold the position test results were needed before winter. So they stayed. 3 men, a shack full of wires, a wind that never stopped speaking. Lathrop wrote his last entry on the night of the 15th. Heard them again closer. Thought it was Carr. It wasn't. The next day, barometers in St. Louis and Kansas City showed a sudden drop, a storm line forming faster than prediction models allowed. Within hours, winds reached hurricane force along the river. And somewhere in that chaos, the outpost went dark. When rescue crews arrived, they found the telegraph pole bent, but unbroken wire stretched taut, as if something below had pulled it. The soil around the shack crackled, faintly magnetized by the strike. And the air, witnesses said, carried a low hum that faded only after sunrise. Scientists would later write it off as an atmospheric anomaly, a trick of physics. But soldiers who guarded the bluff afterward told another story. They said the ground whispered when you walked over it, not words but cadence. Like a line still alive beneath the earth, pulsing with a message no one dared answer. Years later, when the river shifted course and cut deeper into the bluff, fragments of the old telegraph line surfaced from the mud wire blackened glass insulators fused by heat. Archaeologists noted faint markings on one plate, hand-carved letters SR, hold position. They never found the bodies, and so the place became more silence than soil. A gap on the map fenced forgotten. But the wind still moves there, as it always did, tracing invisible lines through the valley, singing to itself across the years. Because the truth about Dead Man's Bluff is this. It was never just about a missing crew or a freak storm. It was about a message that refused to end. A conversation the land began and still continues. Every time the wind crosses that ridge, carrying words no one should remember, and yet somehow, always does. The records still exist. Tucked away in weather-stained folders, marked Signal Corps Experimental Line 1898. The paper smells of dust and oil, the ink pale and nervous. Inside numbers, charts, coordinates. No mention of voices, no hint of fear. Only data. The Army didn't deal in folklore, it dealt in voltage resistance and error margins. Between October and November 1898, the Corps conducted a series of long-range transmission tests across the Missouri corridor. Each station reported signal strength, atmospheric interference, and coil performance. Outpost 14. Dead Man's Bluff produced the most inconsistent readings. Frequency fluctuations reached levels 10 times higher than surrounding lines. Log entry 11-9-1898 reads, Signal oscillation unexplained. Wind velocity constant. Atmospheric charge above predicted level. That's the first crack in the record. The instruments used were primitive induction coils, wound by hand batteries filled with acid and brass terminals prone to corrosion. Even so, the data shows something strange, current spikes occurring when the system was powered down. In short, the line spoke when no one was speaking. Telegraph engineers at Fort Leavenworth reviewed the anomaly. Their conclusion: possible residual magnetism in the line. But the report margin holds a handwritten note, initials unknown. Residual doesn't transmit in full phrases. To them, it was physics misbehaving. To us, it's the echo of a conversation the records refuse to explain. Weather data from the same week tells its own story. The U.S. Army Signal Service recorded rapid barometric collapse across the Midwest. In Columbia, the pressure fell from 29.9 to 28.7 inches in less than 12 hours, a record at the time. Wind speeds hit 58 miles per hour, gusting higher on exposed ridges. Engineers believe these conditions created resonant sound waves trapped and amplified between the bluff walls and the frozen river surface. In theory, that resonance could imitate patterns, even words. But none of it accounted for rhythm, because the transmissions logged at Dead Man's Bluff were not random. They carried timing pause intervals identical to Morse code. One pattern repeated again and again, dot dash pause, translating to the letter R. The first letter of received. Each entry after that carried new fragments. Dashes stretching longer, pauses shorter, like something learning to talk through the wires. One transmission lasted exactly 13 seconds. It began at 11:04 p.m., wind at 46 miles per hour. Recorded voltage 23.8. The pattern matched no known interference. The operator's note beneath it reads, sounded human low tone repeated twice. Folklore loves a voice. Science demands a source. But what happens when the instruments record both, and neither can explain the other? Historians later trace the outpost's chain of command. The supervising engineer was Lieutenant Henry G. Madsen, a graduate of West Point class of 1891, transferred from Fort Myer. His official statement after the disappearance is still archived. No evidence of attack. Structural failure consistent with high winds. Telegraph apparatus irreparable. Recommend closure of site. Signed, dated, and sealed. Yet tucked behind that form on the reverse side of the envelope, someone had written 3 words in pencil. Faint hurried, pressed hard enough to leave a dent. They answered back. A postscript never meant to be read. By early 1899, the Corps had buried the project. Reports shifted focus to new relay experiments in Kansas. The Bluff station was written off as lost to weather. But in an 1899 internal memo, a supply requisition from Fort Leavenworth mentions recovery of damaged telegraph instruments producing acoustic effects when wind present. Acoustic effects that's as close as they came to saying the air still spoke. Decades later, researchers found traces of the same phenomenon. 1931, civilian conservation corps workers clearing the bluff heard whistling tones recurring every few minutes. 1952, local radio operators picked up unmodulated signals on shortwave frequencies, repeating at intervals of 4.7 seconds, the same period recorded in 1898. Every generation found the same heartbeat, steady, patient, inexplicable. The terrain itself tells part of the story. Geological surveys show the bluff composed of alternating layers of chert shale and iron quartzite, a natural sound chamber. When wind passes through fissures, it creates tones between 300 and 500 hertz human vocal range. Combine that with the metallic residue of the old wires still buried beneath the soil, and you have a perfect resonator. So maybe the voices were nothing more than wind, finding memory in metal. But why the patterns? Why English cadence? Why phrases that match documented transmissions from earlier years? The skeptics point to coincidence. The believers point to proof, dozens of recorded anomalies, exact timings, identical syntax. And in the middle, the historians linger, forced to decide whether coincidence can write full sentences. There's another detail, small but impossible to ignore. In 1902, a flood exposed part of the old telegraph line. Locals collected the insulator's glass, hardened to milky white by heat. One of them, found near the base of the bluff, contained something fused inside a thin fragment of paper. When cleaned and unrolled, it revealed 4 letters written in graphite: SRRD. Experts couldn't decode it. Others believed it stood for Signal Received Repeat Dead. No one can say for sure. But the pattern keeps circling back, always to the same phrase, always to the same echo. Later in 1974, a physicist from the University of Missouri named Dr. Alan Copeland revisited the site with portable seismographs. He reported subharmonic pulses in the ground whenever wind exceeded 40 mph. The rhythm 5 seconds apart. His paper, published in Applied Geophysical Review, ends with one sentence. This resonance behaves as though the Earth is remembering pressure. Pressure, memory, language. That's the triad of this mystery. And somewhere in those intersections, the truth hums low, patient beyond measure. Archival footage from 1910 shows the Corps dismantling the last remains of the relay poles. The men look small against the sky, shovels flashing in pale light, wind whipping the river into ribbons of silver. The camera catches something odd. One worker pauses, turns his head as if hearing something behind him. His mouth opens. The footage ends. It would be easy to dismiss that as chance film flicker imagination. But when sound engineers analyzed the surviving reel, they detected a faint hiss, not from degradation, but from interference. Its waveform matched the same 4.7-second cycle found in 1898. No matter the decade, the signal returns. Every test, every attempt to explain, only reawakens it. When modern sensors were installed in 2012, they registered an identical harmonic low and human repeating like breath drawn through stone. So what is it? Wind through quartz. Electromagnetic feedback. A century-old accident looping through nature's circuits, or as the old rivermen whispered, a message that never reached its destination. Still traveling, still seeking an ear to answer. Maybe that's what Dead Man's Bluff truly became. Not a place of death, but a transmitter without end. A dialogue between land and memory. A system the Corps built and nature claimed. Fact after fact, number after number. Still leads back to one thing: repetition. A pattern too human to dismiss, too constant to believe. When the line fell silent, the earth began to speak. When men stopped sending, the wind began to reply. And all that remains today, in data and myth, in static between frequencies, is the same phrase cycling endlessly through time. Signal received. The night before the storm, the air was too still. Carr wrote that in his private notebook, a single line beneath a smudge of ash. The wind had gone quiet, like the land itself was waiting. The river below moved without sound, a flat silver ribbon under the half-moon. Inside the telegraph shack, the lantern flickered low, its flame pulsing against the wall like a heartbeat out of rhythm. Avery sat by the door, boots unlaced, rubbing warmth into his hands. He was only 21, the youngest of the crew, a farm boy from Iowa who had never seen the river in flood or the wind turn cruel. Lathrop leaned over the instruments, checking wires that hummed faintly even when disconnected. Carr stood near the window, listening. Always listening. He said it had started to speak again around dusk. Not words this time, more like breath. A kind of long exhale drawn through the timber and wire. He asked the others if they heard it. They nodded, though none could say from where it came. In the quiet, the sound was almost soothing, a low hum beneath the hiss of oil lamps. But the more they listened, the more the hum broke apart into syllables, into something close to speech. Lathrop turned the key. Once short pulse, long pulse, pause. Test pattern. Seconds later, the pattern came back. Faint, exact, as though the air itself was practicing Morse. Avery's face drained white. Carr told him it was resonance, nothing more. A trick of weather. But he couldn't stop watching the key, its small metal lever, trembling on its own. The lantern flame jumped each time the sound repeated, as if some invisible breath passed through the room. Outside, the mist had thickened. The ridge vanished behind it. Even the river sound disappeared. When Avery stepped out to fetch more oil, he said he felt the ground vibrate, not shaking, just pulsing steady as a heartbeat. He pressed his hand to the soil. It felt warm. He came back inside, pale and quiet. "It's not the wire," he whispered. "It's the earth." Carr didn't answer. He was staring at the logbook pen hovering above the page. On the line dated November 15th, he wrote 3 words. It answered twice. Then he set the pen down, folded the book closed, and looked toward the door. They ate in silence that night, hard biscuits, cold beans, black coffee. Every sound seemed magnified, the scrape of tin, the tick of the lantern wick. At intervals, the whisper returned. Sometimes it sounded like wind through pine needles. Other times like a human sigh drawn from too far away to belong to anyone living. When Avery asked if they should send for relief, Carr shook his head. "We'll finish the test," he said. "Then we'll go." His voice was calm, but his eyes stayed fixed on the window. By midnight, the first gust hit hard enough to rattle the door. The shack groaned in its joints. Lathrop checked the instruments. The coil needles swung wildly, reacting to the static in the air. Sparks crawled along the wire tips, faint blue, almost alive. Carr reached to ground the circuit, but the current jolted through his glove, snapping his arm back. Then, silence. A long, impossible silence. The lantern dimmed to ember. The world outside disappeared, and from that dark came the tapping. Not the key this time. It came from the walls. Slow, deliberate, like fingers testing the rhythm. 1, 2, pause. 1, 2, 3. Carr counted under his breath. The pattern matched the transmissions from earlier that week, the same intervals, the same rising pace. He looked at Lathrop. "That's the signal," he said. Lathrop's mouth opened, but no sound came. The tapping moved closer from wall to floor until it seemed to rise through the planks beneath their feet. The lantern flared once, bright enough to throw their shadows across the ceiling, and in that light, for a heartbeat, Avery swore he saw movement behind Carr, the air bending like heat above a road. A shape forming out of pressure and dust. Then darkness again. He stumbled back, knocking over the oil can. The lantern sputtered. Carr shouted to hold position, but the wind outside screamed louder. A rising roar, the shack trembling as if gripped by a giant hand. The telegraph key began to move on its own. One strike. Then another. The pattern relentless. Signal received. Carr slammed the breaker switch, but the circuit was already alive, wires glowing faintly red in the dark. Sparks jumped like fireflies. The sound deepened, not just in the air, but in the bones. Each pulse seemed to vibrate through their ribs. Avery dropped to his knees, clutching his ears. Lathrop shouted something lost in the noise. Carr grabbed the logbook and wrote in a shaking scrawl, "It knows our words." Then the roof tore away. Wind and dust exploded through the room. The lanterns shattered. Everything turned white cold, bright, endless. Avery felt himself lifted, spun, thrown down. His mouth filled with earth. For a moment he thought he heard singing a woman's voice, gentle, distant, threaded through the howl. Then nothing. When the storm passed, dawn found the bluff silent again. Only fragments of the shack remained, splinters, embedded in the soil, metal twisted like ribbon. They say one man was found days later, far downriver. Face upward, eyes open, and still curled as if holding a key. The current had carried him 20 miles. The skin of his palm was burned where metal had fused to it. The coroner wrote only one note beside the body's tag, "Cause unknown, possible lightning." But the strangest detail came from the diver who helped retrieve him. When he surfaced, he told the sheriff the water had been humming not loud, but steady deep beneath the current. A rhythm that felt alive. Avery's name appeared once in a follow-up report marked as unrecovered. Carr's was stamped lost. Lathrop's presumed deceased. Their equipment was melted, their notebooks scattered. Only one page survived, pressed between stones by the flood, a note barely legible written in pencil that the water hadn't washed away. "If it calls, don't reply." No one knows who wrote it. Years later, farmers rebuilding fences on the ridge claimed that when the wind blows from the north, the wire sings. It's faint, a single continuous note that rises and falls with the gusts. Sometimes if you stand there long enough, they say, the tone breaks into rhythm. And in that rhythm, some swear they still hear it, the same pulse, the same word stretched by a century of distance. Signal, received. They tried to forget the bluff. They tried to bury it under data and soil. But time has a way of repeating, just like a transmission that never stops looping. By the mid-20th century, a new generation of scientists, men armed with oscilloscopes, field recorders, and portable transmitters, returned to the Missouri Valley. They called it Project Echo Wind. Officially, it was a study on atmospheric distortion. Unofficially, they wanted to hear what Carr heard. The first team arrived in October 1949, led by physicist Harold Breen, an acoustic engineer from the U.S. Army Signal Laboratory. His field notes survive site unstable, wind patterns irregular, subsurface resonance detected at 21.9 Hz. Then another line, almost hesitant audible tone, resembles voice frequency. They planted sensors across the ridge, 12 pressure microphones, and a single magnetic coil buried 6 feet deep. The data came back in pulses every 4.7 seconds, consistent, unwavering. To Breen, it was mechanical perfection. To the men in the field, it was human mimicry. He described it as an echo that does not decay. During one night recording at 02:16 a.m., a technician named Foster swore he heard his own name through the headphones, stretched, delayed, then repeated twice. The log captures his reaction in the margin feedback loop. Number source external. That was the first time the wind answered modern equipment. By 1950, Project Echo Wind expanded into a full military study. The Signal Laboratory brought in meteorologists, linguists, even a cryptographer, because what the microphones caught began to resemble pattern speech. Repetition phrasing, intonation. One phrase stood out among the filtered results, line clear, the same expression used in telegraph protocol more than 50 years before. To the analysts, it was impossible. The probability of random natural resonance producing consistent Morse rhythm was less than 1 in 10 million. Yet the recordings existed. 12 reels stored under atmospheric audio, Missouri Test Zone. Each labeled simply Dead Bluff Series. And then abruptly, the project stopped. Funding withdrawn, records sealed. Breen's report ends mid-sentence. Evidence suggests persistence of acoustic mem, and then nothing. It would take another generation to open those files again. In 1973, the Smithsonian Acoustic Archives cataloged one reel under historical anomalies. Sound engineer Thomas Kellerman digitized it, converting analog hum into visible waveforms. What he saw shocked him, repeating peaks every 4.7 seconds, but with embedded micro-variations identical to human breath intervals. He wrote in the margin, "Pattern behaves like respiration." Kellerman played it through a low-pass filter, and what emerged wasn't static. It was voice. Not clear, not decipherable, but undeniably human. A breath caught in the machinery of air. He never published his results. He simply wrote, "No one will believe this," and sealed the reel back into storage. But belief has a way of leaking through cracks. 2 decades later, in 1994, graduate student Sarah Lynn from the University of Kansas uncovered Kellerman's notes. Using new spectral software, she reconstructed the original sound layers, isolating harmonics, removing interference. The deeper she went, the more the noise began to arrange itself. Consonants forming vowels, emerging syllables half born from wind. One section, 16 seconds long, produced what sounded like a voice whispering, "SR. Hold position." The same initials carved into that glass insulator found in 1902. When Lynn published her paper Residual Harmonic Patterns in Aeolian Structures, her peers dismissed it as pareidolia, humans hearing meaning in random chaos. But the pattern refused to vanish. It appeared again in recordings from unrelated experiments, bridges, towers, deep canyons, all along the Missouri River basin. Always the same cycle. Always the same 4.7-second breath. By the early 2000s, digital forensics entered the story. Engineers ran frequency analysis comparing Project Echo wind data with early 1898 telegraph codes archived by the War Department. The overlap, 93% pattern match. Statistically impossible unless the sound carried somehow through medium and time. The military's reaction was swift. They reclaimed access to the ridge, reclassified all documentation as environmental hazard. The official reason, unstable soil. But internal memos leaked in 2011 told another version. A paragraph reads, "Persistent infrasonic phenomena. Potential hazard to personnel. Recommend site closure. No verbal transmission within test zone." No verbal transmission because even modern instruments started talking back. When the 2012 research team set up barometric sensors, the ones that caught the 17 to 22 Hz resonance, they weren't expecting linguistic structure. But the spectrograms painted something undeniable, repeating harmonic overtones matching spoken cadence in English phonemes. The lead scientist, Dr. Copeland's successor, noted, "It modulates when speech occurs nearby as if responding to presence." They shut down the study after 3 weeks. Several technicians reported tinnitus, nosebleeds, and vivid dreams involving clicking or tapping sounds. One described hearing the phrase, "signal clear" during sleep, always at the same pitch. Outsiders called it superstition. Insiders called it feedback. But between superstition and feedback lies something thin. The point where human memory and natural resonance overlap. That's where Dead Man's Bluff lives now, between physics and folklore. Between the pulse of data and the pulse of something older. If you look at the waveforms side by side, the 1898 telegraph pulses and the 2012 infrasound logs, they match almost perfectly. Frequency deviation less than 0.3%, the same beat, the same pause, the same breath. Outsmarted by the wind. Outproduced by the earth itself, outflanked by a memory no circuit could erase. Historians once claimed the frontier ended when the last wire reached the coast. But maybe the frontier simply shifted, from geography to resonance, from land to air, from man to machine. What car began on that ridge, a test, a signal, a simple proof of distance, became something else entirely. A cycle without origin or end. Even today, if you tune to the right frequency around 21 Hz and amplify it against white noise, the pattern still appears. A faint rise, a pause, a fall. Some call it the Missouri Pulse. Some call it coincidence. But those who've heard it in person say it sounds like breath. Engineers have tried to reproduce it in controlled environments, chambers, tunnels, vacuum tubes. Nothing repeats it. Nothing answers. Only on that bluff, only when the wind hits just right, the line speaks again. And when it does, no instrument on Earth can tell you if it's current or memory. It's here the tipping point where evidence becomes echo. The contrast between what's measurable and what's felt. They thought they'd mapped every law of sound. They thought the line had fallen silent. But the bluff outlasted them all. Every storm that crosses the valley reawakens the pulse, not as thunder, not as wind, but as a whisper stretched thin between worlds. A whisper that says one thing over and over across a century of static. Signal received. They had tried everything to silence it. Every instrument, every explanation, every page of data rewritten to erase the impossible. Yet still the bluff spoke. The message kept coming, crossing decades, outlasting machines, outlasting men. By 2015, the Army Corps of Engineers filed its final report, 147 pages of technical language and denial. Acoustic resonance caused by geological structure, it read. No anomalous behavior beyond environmental factors. But the graphs told another story. Each chart showed a spike at exactly 4.7 seconds, over and over again. The same rhythm that had haunted every experiment for more than a century. The Corps called it coincidence. The scientists called it interference. But the wind called it memory. Inside those sealed files was one final entry. A note from Dr. Copeland's successor dated March 12, 2014. We cut the line completely. No wire, no transmitter. Still the signal returned. Same cycle, lower frequency. Duration indefinite. Source undetermined. They had disconnected every cable, every grounding rod. Still, it answered back. And in that moment, in that quiet admission written in bureaucratic code, the truth stood naked. The line was never electrical. It was elemental. When they revisited the bluff one last time, the place had changed. The trees had grown over the ruins, roots threading through the rusted coils. The old telegraph pole still leaned against the sky, blackened, half swallowed by earth. The wind moved through its hollow spine like breath through bone. The sound team set up one final recording. Just wind at first, steady and different. Then, the pulse. 4.7 seconds, low, drawn-out, patient. Someone whispered, "There it is." And right then the spectrogram monitor flickered, tracing the same shape that Carr had logged 117 years before. For a long moment, no one spoke. The instruments kept listening. And when they slowed the playback, when they stretched the audio across time, the rhythm transformed into speech. Faint, layered. Multiple voices interlacing like threads pulled through static. No clear language, only the cadence of human breath rising and falling, like memory, learning to speak again. No storm that night. No interference, just wind, and words that should not exist. The lead researcher stood there until dawn. Later she would write in her field notes, there was no fear, only recognition, as if the air was remembering something for us. Recognition. That's the word that keeps returning. The wind didn't haunt. It remembered. It responded. It bore witness to everything that passed across it, the storm, the voices, the signal that began as an experiment and became a legend. At some point, every rational mind in that valley broke the same way, bending toward wonder. Maybe that's what history does when it reaches its limits. It turns back into story. Because when they compared all the data, 1898, 1949, 1973, 2012, the cycle never changed. The pulse was constant, only the amplitude shifted with weather. It was as if the earth itself kept repeating the same message over and over until someone finally listened. By then, most of the researchers had moved on. The Corps shut down access. The university archives sealed the files. Yet some nights when the barometric pressure drops, the signal still leaks into nearby radio bands. A low hum, barely audible. But those who know what to listen for say it's there. Farmers on the Missouri Ridge say their cattle turn east when it begins. River workers claim their radios tick with phantom static when storms rise over the Dakotas. A retired pilot once recorded it from the air 8,000 feet above the valley, the same 4.7-second pulse, repeating like a heartbeat beneath the clouds. It is not lightning. It is not wire. It is something else. You can call it resonance. You can call it myth, but perhaps it is both. Because sound, more than sight, carries the soul of memory. When a word is spoken, it never truly vanishes. It lingers in the medium that held it, the air, the water, the stone. It leaves a fingerprint on the world. And under the right conditions, that fingerprint plays back. Carr never knew what he discovered. He thought he was building a line between two posts of iron and wire. Instead, he built a bridge between worlds, between what can be measured and what can only be felt. And now, long after his bones turn to dust, his signal endures looping through the elements caught between pressure and silence. Historians have a word for this kind of endurance persistence of record. It means a trace of the past that refuses to fade, even when its origin is gone. Dead Man's Bluff became that, a persistence of record written not on paper, but in the air itself. One last document found in the Corps archive carries a typed memo marked Decommissioning Note, 2017. The closing sentence reads, "Equipment removed, area stable, no further anomalies detected." But the technician who signed it told another story in a private interview 10 years later. He said that as they packed the final instruments, he heard tapping, faint but rhythmic, from the wind gauge. When he placed his hand on the metal, he felt vibration beneath it, slow and steady. He thought of the stories of Carr, of the whispers of that endless reply, and he said softly, "All right, I hear you." The vibration stopped. He never went back. Somewhere between science and silence. That's where the story ends. Not with a scream, not with proof, but with acknowledgement. A quiet nod from one century to another. Because maybe that's what Dead Man's Bluff was always about. Not ghosts, not miracles, but continuity. A reminder that sound once made never dies. It only waits for the right air, the right pressure, the right listener. And if you stand there on a still night above the river, that has erased and rewritten its banks 100 times. If you let the wind move through you slow and even, you might hear it too. A pattern, a pause, a breath. Then through the hum, a single phrase stretched thin across time, soft enough to be almost imagined. "Signal received. Dawn on the bluff." A pale light climbing over the river's edge, soft, colorless, almost reluctant. The trees stand motionless now, branches heavy with frost. From a distance, it could be any morning, a forgotten ridge, a river still whispering its own language to the stones. But if you listen closely, truly listen, you can hear the air move in a rhythm that doesn't belong to weather. It comes slow, patient, 4.7 seconds apart. Nothing remains of the telegraph post, only a hollow impression in the soil where the pole once stood, now filled with rainwater that mirrors the sky. The earth looks healed. Yet underneath, the instruments still hum faintly, recording the silence that refuses to stay silent. Locals say the valley breathes differently here. That when storms roll over from the west, the wind hesitates, bends, pauses as if remembering its cue. They don't talk about it often. They've learned to live with the sound the same way you live with a scar, invisible most days, but always there when the weather changes. History has no category for places like this. It can list the names, the dates, the coordinates, but it cannot list the feeling of standing where time folds back on itself. The official story ends with a report, but the unofficial one never ends at all. It lingers in every gust of wind that crosses the ridge, in every breath that carries a trace of the old signal. Somewhere beneath the language of equations and reports lies something simpler, an acknowledgement. That the earth, like us, keeps a record It remembers pressure, vibration, resonance, and sometimes when conditions align, it plays them back. It's strange, isn't it, that the same wind which erases footprints can also preserve a voice. That the same air that carried commands of war now carries the sigh of remembrance. Maybe Carr never meant to create a legend. Maybe all he wanted was to measure a distance from sender to receiver, from silence to reply. But what he built was a mirror, one that reflected not only sound, but the persistence of meaning. Standing here today, a century later, you can almost imagine him lantern in hand, coat pulled tight against the cold, listening to a world that refused to go quiet. You can imagine his fear and his awe when the air spoke back. And maybe that's what matters most, not whether it was real, but that it was heard. Because history isn't only the things we can prove. It's also the things that refuse to die. In the telling, the murmurs that travel from one mouth to another, long after the instruments have rusted away. Every culture has its echo, a mountain that hums a river, that sings a wind, that knows a name. Dead Man's Bluff is simply America's version of that truth, a reminder that even in the most rational century, mystery still finds a voice. The engineers called it resonance. The locals called it memory. The soldiers called it warning. But maybe it was all three. In 2020, a field researcher placed a digital sensor there, again just once out of curiosity. The readings were unremarkable. Until midnight. Then the pulse returned faint but certain, recorded over exactly 47 minutes. When she slowed the file down, what she heard wasn't a word at all, but the sound of breathing. Calm, steady, endless. She deleted the file, said she didn't want to own it. No one really wants to own a sound like that. Because when the past answers, it doesn't just speak, it asks. It asks why we keep building machines to measure wonder. Why we fear what we cannot translate. Why we draw lines through wild country and then forget to listen to what those lines awaken. Perhaps the real message of Dead Man's Bluff was never signal received. Perhaps it was a question whispered through a century of static, waiting for us to finally hear it. Are you listening? If you visit the place now, stand by the edge. Where the land falls toward the water, you'll feel the wind push against your chest. It's colder there, thinner. The sound comes and goes, never quite repeating itself the same way twice. Some say it's nothing. Some say it's everything. And as the river bends away, carrying mist and memory toward the horizon, you begin to understand not all echoes fade. Some settle into the bones of the world. Some become the voice beneath all others, reminding us that no transmission, no story, no name is ever truly lost. It only waits for the right frequency to be found again. What if all along we were never the senders, but the receivers? What if every word we speak leaves a shadow in the air, circling back someday to find us? What if the earth itself remembers more faithfully than we do? The wind rises once more, shaking the dead grass, brushing against the old stones. The hum returns, faint, rhythmic, alive. A long breath in, a pause, then out again. Signal received. Fade to black.